Woman's car breaks down. The stranger who helps her was the hero she mistreated years ago. Rachel's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as she navigated the winding highway, her knuckles white with tension. The clock on her dashboard glowed, 11:42 p.m., a stark reminder of how late it was and how desperately she wanted to be home. The day had been a whirlwind of meetings, presentations, and last-minute crises at the office, leaving her mentally and physically exhausted. Rain pelted the windshield, creating a hypnotic rhythm that threatened to lull her into a dangerous state of drowsiness. Rachel shook her head, forcing herself to focus on the road ahead. The headlights of her sleek sedan barely penetrated the thick curtain of water, revealing only a few yards of asphalt at a time. As she rounded yet another bend, a strange sound caught her attention. It was a faint rattling, almost lost beneath the steady drumming of the rain and the soft hum of the radio. Rachel frowned, her brow furrowing with concern. She'd been meaning to take the car in for a checkup, but her packed schedule had always gotten in the way. Now, miles from anywhere, she was beginning to regret her procrastination. Just a little further, she muttered to herself, willing the car to hold together for just a few more miles. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The rattling grew louder, accompanied by an ominous sputtering from under the hood. Rachel's heart began to race as she felt the car losing power. She eased her foot off the accelerator, guiding the failing vehicle toward the shoulder of the road. With a final, defeated cough, the engine died completely. For a moment, Rachel sat in stunned silence, the only sound the continued patter of rain on metal and glass. Then, with trembling hands, she turned the key in the ignition. Nothing, not even a sputter. She tried again and again, each attempt more desperate than the last, but the engine remained stubbornly silent. "No, no, no," Rachel whispered, panic rising in her chest like a tide. She fumbled for her phone, praying for a signal, but the screen mockingly displayed "no service" in the upper left corner. Of course, she was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by hills that blocked any hope of a cellular connection. The reality of her situation began to sink in. She was alone, stranded on a deserted highway in the middle of the night, with no way to call for help. Rachel closed her eyes, taking deep breaths in an attempt to calm her racing heart. She was a problem solver, a crisis manager. Surely she could handle this. Opening her eyes, Rachel surveyed her surroundings. The rain had eased slightly, but visibility was still poor. Dense forests lined both sides of the road, their shadows seeming to loom over her tiny island of relative safety. In the distance, she thought she could make out the faint glow of lights, but they were too far away to offer any immediate hope. With a resigned sigh, Rachel reached for the latch and pushed open her car door. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the earthy scent of rain-soaked soil and pine. She stepped out, her heels immediately sinking into the soft ground of the shoulder. Muttering a curse, she kicked them off, preferring bare feet to the risk of a twisted ankle. The hood of the car was still warm as Rachel propped it open, squinting in the dim light of her phone's flashlight. But the jumble of pipes, wires, and metal beneath might as well have been alien technology for all the sense it made to her. In her world of boardrooms and business strategies, changing a tire was about the extent of her automotive knowledge. As the minutes ticked by, Rachel's initial panic began to morph into a gnawing sense of dread. How long would she be stuck here? Would anyone even drive by on this remote stretch of road? And if they did, would it be safe to accept their help? She thought of all the horror stories she'd heard about women alone on dark highways, and a shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Rachel had always prided herself on her independence, on her ability to handle any situation life threw at her. But now, soaked to the skin and utterly alone, she felt more vulnerable than she had in years. Closing the hood with a defeated slam, Rachel leaned against the side of her car, her mind racing through possible solutions. She could try walking, but in this darkness, with no idea how far the nearest town might be, that seemed like a recipe for disaster. She could wait until morning, hoping that daylight would bring both better visibility and more traffic. Or she could hope that by some miracle, a good Samaritan would happen by. As if in answer to her unspoken plea, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the misty rain like a beacon of hope. Rachel's heart leapt, a mixture of relief and apprehension flooding through her. Help was coming, but would it be the kind of help she needed? She watched as the vehicle drew closer, revealing itself to be an old pickup truck. It was the kind of vehicle she might have sneered at in her younger days, associating it with a lifestyle far removed from her world of corporate success. But now, it looked like salvation on wheels. The truck slowed as it approached, and Rachel straightened up, trying to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. She was acutely aware of how she must look, barefoot, her designer suit soaked through, her carefully styled hair now a bedraggled mess. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that someone had stopped, someone who might be able to help her out of this nightmare. As the driver's door of the pickup opened, Rachel held her breath, her body tense and ready to flee if necessary. But as the figure stepped out into the rain, something in his demeanor, a quiet assurance, a lack of threat, made her relax, if only slightly. Little did Rachel know that this chance encounter on a rainy night would be more than just a rescue from a broken-down car. It would be the beginning of a journey that would force her to confront her past, challenge her perceptions, and ultimately, change her life in ways she could never have imagined. The pickup truck's engine rumbled to a stop, its headlights still illuminating Rachel's stranded vehicle. In the harsh glare, she could make out the truck's weathered paint and a few small dents, signs of a vehicle that had seen its fair share of rough roads and honest work. The contrast between this rugged truck and her own sleek, city-bred sedan couldn't have been more stark. As the driver's door creaked open, Rachel instinctively took a step back, her heart pounding. A tall figure emerged, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the misty glow of the headlights. He moved with a deliberate grace that spoke of strength tempered by caution, as if he was trying not to startle her. "Need some help?" The man's voice carried clearly through the patter of rain, deep and steady. There was no threat in his tone, just a simple offer of assistance. Rachel hesitated, her mind racing. Every instinct honed by years in the cutthroat business world told her to be wary, to keep her guard up. But another part of her, perhaps the part that remembered simpler times and smaller towns, urged her to accept the offered help. "Yes, please," she finally replied, surprised by the tremor in her own voice. "My car just died. I'm not sure what's wrong." The man nodded, stepping closer. As he entered the pool of light cast by Rachel's car, she got her first clear look at him. He was older than she had initially thought, probably in his early 40s. His face was weathered, with lines that spoke of long days under the sun. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, kind and clear, with a depth that hinted at experiences beyond her understanding. Without another word, he moved to the front of her car, his movements efficient and purposeful. He popped the hood with practiced ease, barely glancing at Rachel as he began his inspection. She watched, fascinated despite herself, as his large hands moved deftly among the engine components. "I'm Rachel," she offered, feeling an inexplicable need to break the silence. The man looked up briefly, a small smile touching his lips. "John?" he replied simply, before turning his attention back to the engine. As John worked, Rachel found herself studying him more closely. His clothes were well worn but clean, a flannel shirt rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle, and jeans that had faded to a soft blue. A baseball cap, pulled low over his eyes, completed the picture of rural simplicity. Yet there was something about him that didn't quite fit the image of a simple country mechanic. It was in the way he held himself, a quiet dignity and self-assurance that spoke of a life lived with purpose. Rachel, used to reading people quickly in her line of work, sensed layers to this man that weren't immediately apparent. "Looks like your alternator gave out," John said, straightening up. "I can probably get it running enough to get you to the next town, but you'll need to have it replaced properly." Rachel blinked, surprised by the quick diagnosis. Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." John shrugged, a modest gesture that seemed to deflect her gratitude. Anyone would have stopped to help. But Rachel knew that wasn't true. In her world, people were more likely to pass by, too busy with their own lives to get involved in someone else's problems. This man's willingness to help a stranger in the middle of the night was a rarity, and it touched something deep inside her. As John continued to work, occasionally asking her to try starting the engine, Rachel found herself relaxing despite the strange situation. There was something comforting about his presence, a calm certainty that seemed to push back the darkness and uncertainty of the night. "So, what brings you out this way so late?" she asked, curiosity getting the better of her. John paused in his work, glancing up at her. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of something, pain, regret, in his eyes. But it was gone so quickly, she couldn't be sure. "Just heading home," he said simply. "I work over in the next county. Late shift." Rachel nodded, sensing that there was more to the story, but respecting his privacy. After all, she was a stranger to him as much as he was to her. As the minutes ticked by, Rachel found herself growing more and more intrigued by this quiet, competent man. In her world of fast-talking executives and polished presentations, John's silent efficiency was a breath of fresh air. He didn't waste words or movements, every action purposeful and effective. Finally, with a last adjustment, John stepped back from the engine. "Try it now," he instructed. Rachel slid into the driver's seat, her heart pounding with hope and trepidation. She turned the key, and to her immense relief, the engine sputtered to life. It didn't sound perfect, but it was running. She emerged from the car, a wide smile on her face. "You did it. I can't thank you enough." John wiped his hands on a rag he pulled from his pocket, that small, understated smile once again touching his lips. "Happy to help. You should be able to make it to Millbrook. It's about 20 miles down the road. There's a garage there that can fix you up properly." Rachel nodded, making a mental note of the information, but as she looked at John, preparing to leave, she felt an unexpected reluctance. This man had done more than just fix her car. He had been a beacon of kindness in what had been a dark and frightening situation. Is there anything I can do to repay you?" she asked, suddenly aware that she had nothing to offer that would seem valuable to a man like this. John shook his head. "No need. Just glad I could help." As he turned to go, Rachel felt a strange sense of loss. It was ridiculous, she knew. This man was a stranger, someone she had known for less than an hour. And yet, there was something about him, a quiet strength, an unassuming kindness that had touched her deeply. "Wait," she called out, surprising herself. John paused, turning back to her with a questioning look. Thank you. Not just for fixing the car, but for stopping. For being kind. It means more than you know." For a moment, John's stoic expression softened, and Rachel caught a glimpse of the man behind the quiet exterior. There was warmth there, and understanding, and something else she couldn't quite name. "You're welcome, Rachel," he said softly. "Take care of yourself." As he walked back to his truck, Rachel watched him go, a mix of emotions swirling inside her. Relief at her rescue, gratitude for his kindness, and an inexplicable feeling that this chance encounter was somehow significant. Little did she know that this was just the beginning. As she prepared to continue her journey, Rachel had no idea that her path would cross with John's again, in a way that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and the world around her. As Rachel settled back into her car, the engine's soft purr a comforting contrast to the earlier silence. She found her thoughts drifting back to the stranger who had come to her aid. There was something about him, John, she reminded herself, that nagged at the edges of her memory. It wasn't just gratitude for his help that kept him in her mind. There was a sense of familiarity that she couldn't shake. She watched in the rearview mirror as John's pickup truck pulled away, its taillights gradually fading into the misty night. The rain had eased to a gentle drizzle, and the world outside seemed softer somehow, less threatening than it had been just an hour ago. Rachel shook her head, trying to clear the fog of exhaustion and lingering adrenaline. She needed to focus on getting to Millbrook and finding that garage John had mentioned. But as she put the car in drive and slowly pulled back onto the highway, her mind kept circling back to him. It wasn't just his kindness that struck her, though that had been remarkable enough. There was something in his manner, in the way he carried himself, that seemed to resonate with a half-forgotten memory. Rachel prided herself on her sharp mind and attention to detail, skills that had served her well in her climb up the corporate ladder. But now, those same skills were picking at the edges of a recollection she couldn't quite grasp. As she drove, the monotony of the dark road allowed her thoughts to wander. She found herself thinking back over the years, trying to place where she might have encountered someone like John before. It wasn't in her current social circles, that was for certain. The polished, ambitious people she surrounded herself with now were a far cry from the quiet, unassuming man who had helped her tonight. No, if she had met John before, it must have been years ago, before her life had taken the turn that led her to her current success. Rachel's brow furrowed as she delved deeper into her memories, back to a time when she was a very different person. In her early 20s, fresh out of college and burning with ambition, Rachel had been a force to be reckoned with. She had been determined to prove herself, to rise above her humble beginnings and make her mark on the world. That drive had served her well in many ways, propelling her to heights she had only dreamed of, but it had also made her hard in ways she was only now beginning to recognize. The memory sharpened, bringing with it a wave of emotions Rachel hadn't expected. She saw herself, younger and sharper-edged, sitting at a counter in a small diner. It was the kind of place she would never set foot in now, all chipped formica and greasy menus, but back then, it had been a regular haunt. Cheap food and endless coffee had fueled many late-night study sessions and early morning rushes to internships. In her mind's eye, Rachel watched her younger self, hunched over a textbook, a half-empty cup of coffee at her elbow. She remembered the feeling of that moment, the burning determination, the certainty that she was destined for greater things. But now, with years of perspective, she also saw the harder edges of that young woman. The way her eyes barely flickered up when the bell over the door chimed, the dismissive set of her shoulders that clearly said, "Don't bother me." And then, cutting through the haze of memory, a figure approached. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that had seen better days. Rachel felt a jolt of recognition. It couldn't be. Could it? In the memory, the man paused beside her younger self, his voice low and polite as he asked if he could take the seat next to her. And Rachel, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, remembered what happened next. Her younger self had barely looked up, her voice dripping with disdain as she suggested he find somewhere else to sit. "This isn't a soup kitchen," she had said, the words cutting even in memory. "Maybe you should be looking for a job instead of a handout." The man in her memory had stiffened, his face a mask of hurt quickly hidden behind a stoic expression. Without another word, he had turned and left the diner, leaving behind a silence that should have been deafening, but that Rachel, in her youthful arrogance, had barely noticed. Back in the present, Rachel gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The man from the diner, the veteran she had so callously dismissed, and John, the kind stranger who had just helped her on the side of the road, they were one and the same. "Oh God," Rachel whispered, the words lost in the hum of the engine. How could she not have recognized him immediately? But of course, the answer was clear. The Rachel of today was a far cry from the driven, dismissive young woman she had been. And John, well, time had changed him too, but not in the ways she might have expected. Where she had seen only shabby clothes and assumed poverty, she now recognized the signs of a life lived with purpose rather than for show. The quiet dignity she had admired in John as he fixed her car was the same quality she had so casually dismissed years ago. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Rachel. Here she was, successful beyond her wildest dreams, driving a car that cost more than some people made in a year. And she had been utterly helpless on the side of the road. And who had come to her rescue? The very man she had once deemed unworthy of even sitting next to her. Shame washed over her, hot and uncomfortable. She had spent years cultivating an image of herself as a strong, capable woman who had earned every bit of her success. And in many ways, that was true. But this encounter had forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth, that her rise to the top had come with a cost, not just to herself, but to the way she viewed and treated others. As the lights of Millbrook began to appear in the distance, Rachel found herself at a crossroads that had nothing to do with the physical road beneath her tires. She could continue on as she had been, brushing off this encounter as a strange coincidence. Or she could do something that the Rachel of a few hours ago would have never considered. She could turn back. The very idea sent a thrill of fear through her. Turn back and do what? Apologize for something that had happened years ago? Try to make amends to a man who probably hadn't given her a second thought in all this time. And yet, the memory of John's kindness, his willingness to help a stranger in need, a stranger who, unknowingly, had once treated him so poorly, tugged at something deep inside her. It challenged everything she thought she knew about success, about the way the world worked. Rachel's foot eased off the accelerator as she approached the exit for Millbrook. She had a choice to make, one that could change the course of her carefully planned life. The garage John had mentioned was surely just ahead, offering a quick fix and a return to normalcy. But behind her, somewhere on that dark highway, was a chance at something else, redemption, perhaps, or at least the opportunity to face her past and maybe, just maybe, become a better version of herself. As she signaled for the exit, Rachel realized that the quiet of the car was filled with the sound of her own rapid breathing. She was nervous, she realized, in a way she hadn't been in years. This wasn't a boardroom or a high-stakes negotiation. This was something far more personal, far more frightening. But as she guided her car onto the exit ramp, Rachel felt something else beneath the fear and shame, a glimmer of hope. Hope that it wasn't too late to change, to make amends, to see the world and the people in it through new eyes. The decision she was about to make would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything Rachel thought she knew about herself and the world. But in that moment, as the lights of Millbrook beckoned, all she knew was that she couldn't let this chance slip away. Whether John recognized her or not, whether he accepted her apology or not, she had to try. She owed it to him, to herself, and to the person she wanted to become. With a deep breath, Rachel made her choice. The garage could wait. She had a more important destination in mind. The decision to turn back felt both terrifying and exhilarating to Rachel as she carefully maneuvered her car back onto the highway. The road stretched dark and empty before her, a stark contrast to the tumultuous emotions swirling within. Every mile she drove felt like a step further from her comfort zone, from the carefully constructed world she had built for herself. It didn't take long to spot the familiar silhouette of John's pickup truck, parked at a small rest area just off the highway. Rachel's heart pounded as she pulled in, her headlights illuminating the rustic picnic tables and the lone figure standing beside them. John was there, his back to her, seemingly lost in thought as he gazed out into the misty darkness. For a moment, Rachel sat frozen in her car, her hand on the door handle. What was she doing? What could she possibly say to this man that would make up for her past behavior? But the memory of his kindness, juxtaposed with her own callousness from years ago, gave her the courage to step out into the cool night air. Her heels clicked against the asphalt, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet night. John turned at the noise, his expression a mixture of surprise and curiosity as he recognized her. "Everything all right with the car?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. Rachel took a deep breath, steeling herself. "The car's fine, thanks to you," she began, her voice shakier than she would have liked. "But I need to talk to you about something else, something important." John's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded, gesturing to one of the picnic tables. As they sat down across from each other, Rachel couldn't help but notice how different this setting was from their first encounter. The diner of her memory seemed a world away from this quiet rest stop. I'm sorry if this sounds strange, Rachel started, her words coming out in a rush. But, have we met before? Before tonight? I mean. John's expression changed almost imperceptibly. A flicker of recognition passed through his eyes, quickly replaced by a guarded look. He was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if seeing it for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but firm. Yes, he said simply. I think we have. The confirmation hit Rachel like a physical blow. She had hoped, in some small corner of her heart, that she had been mistaken, that this was all a case of mistaken identity, a trick of her guilty conscience. But John's quiet acknowledgement stripped away any possibility of denial. The diner, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was you, wasn't it? The man I was so rude to. John nodded slowly, his face a mask of calm that betrayed little of what he might be feeling. It was a long time ago, he said, his tone neutral. Rachel felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. The shame she had felt earlier came rushing back, intensified by John's understated response. How could he be so calm, so composed, when she felt like her world was shifting beneath her feet? I can't believe you're the one who helped me tonight, she said, her voice thick with emotion. After the way I treated you, I was horrible, cruel. You didn't deserve that. John was quiet for a moment, his eyes never leaving her face. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. No, I didn't, he agreed. But that was a different time, a different you. Rachel shook her head, unable to accept his easy forgiveness. But it was still me, she insisted. I've spent years telling myself I'm a good person, that I've earned everything I have. But tonight, seeing you again, I realized how much I've lost along the way, how blind I've been. To her surprise, a small smile tugged at the corners of John's mouth. Life has a way of teaching us the lessons we need to learn, he said. Sometimes it takes a while for those lessons to sink in. Rachel stared at him, amazed by his wisdom and lack of bitterness. How can you be so understanding? She asked. I've been carrying the guilt of how I treated you for years, even if I didn't recognize it until now. And you just helped me without a second thought. John's smile widened slightly, a hint of sadness in his eyes. When I came back from my tours, he said, his voice taking on a distant quality, I was angry, bitter. I saw the worst in everyone, expected the worst from everyone. It took me a long time to learn that holding on to that anger was hurting me more than anyone else. He paused, his gaze drifting to the misty forest beyond the rest area. What you did that day in the diner, it hurt. I won't lie about that, but I've learned that everyone's fighting their own battles. The young woman I met that day, she was fighting to prove herself, to rise above her circumstances. I couldn't see it then, but I understand it now. Rachel felt a tear slip down her cheek, quickly brushing it away. That doesn't excuse what I did, she said softly. No, it doesn't, John agreed. But recognizing that, wanting to make it right, that says a lot about who you are now. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared past hanging between them. Rachel felt as though she was seeing John, really seeing him, for the first time. The quiet strength she had admired earlier took on a new depth, born of experiences she could hardly imagine. I don't know how to make this right, Rachel admitted, her voice small in the vast night. John considered her words, his expression thoughtful. Maybe it's not about making it right, he said slowly. Maybe it's about moving forward, learning from it, becoming the person you want to be. An unlikely pair brought together by chance and choice, Rachel felt something shift inside her. The shame and guilt were still there, but alongside them was something new, a sense of possibility, of hope. Thank you, she said softly, the words carrying the weight of years. Not just for tonight, but for your service, for your kindness, for being a better person than I was. John shook his head slightly. We all have our moments, he said. What matters is how we move forward. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Rachel realized that this encounter was more than just about making amends. It was a turning point, a chance to realign her life with the values she had lost sight of along the way. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Rachel felt truly alive. She had been given a second chance, not just to apologize, but to change the course of her life. And as she looked at John, the man who had shown her more kindness than she deserved, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new journey. The first rays of sunlight were just beginning to filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the rest area. Rachel and John sat in a companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The revelation of their shared past hung between them, no longer a barrier but a bridge to understanding. Rachel took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The initial rush of confession had passed, leaving in its wake a need for something more substantial. She turned to John, her eyes meeting his with a determination that surprised even her. "I need to say this properly," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "What I did that day in the diner, it wasn't just rude or thoughtless. It was cruel. I judged you based on nothing more than a glance, and I used that judgment to make myself feel superior. I've carried that moment with me for years, even if I didn't always recognize it, and I am truly, deeply sorry." John listened intently, his face a canvas of emotions. Understanding, a hint of remembered pain, and something else that Rachel couldn't quite define. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the lightening horizon. "Apologies like that," he said finally, his voice soft but clear. "They're rare. Most people, when confronted with their past mistakes, they make excuses. They try to justify. But you owned it. That takes courage." Rachel felt a weight lift from her shoulders, one she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said, "but I hope you know how sincere I am." John turned back to her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving," he said. "It's a choice, and it's one I made a long time ago, not just for you, but for everyone who judged me when I came back from the war." His words hit Rachel like a physical force. She had been so caught up in her own guilt, her own need for absolution, that she hadn't fully considered John's journey. "How did you do it?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "How did you find it in yourself to forgive?" John was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "For a long time, I was angry. At the world, at civilians who couldn't understand what I'd been through, at myself for not being able to adjust." John's gaze seemed to look beyond the rest area, into a past that Rachel could only imagine. "Holding on to that anger," he continued, his voice measured and thoughtful, "it was like carrying around a weight that got heavier every day. It colored everything I saw, everyone I met. I started to realize that I was punishing myself more than anyone else." Rachel listened intently, struck by the raw honesty in John's words. She had spent so long viewing the world through the lens of competition and personal gain that his perspective felt like a revelation. "What changed?" she asked softly, genuinely curious about the journey that had led this man to become the person sitting before her now. A small reflective smile crossed John's face. "I met someone," he said. "Another vet, older than me. He'd been through Vietnam, seen things that made my experiences look tame, but he had this peace about him. I couldn't understand it at first." John paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing. "He told me something I'll never forget. He said, 'Forgiveness isn't about letting others off the hook. It's about freeing yourself.' It took me a while to really understand what he meant, but once I did, well, it changed everything." Rachel felt a lump forming in her throat. The weight of John's words, the journey he'd been through, made her own struggles seem small in comparison. And yet, here he was, extending that same forgiveness to her. "I can't imagine going through what you did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And then to face judgment and misunderstanding when you came back. I'm ashamed that I was part of that." John shook his head gently. "You can't change the past," he said, his tone free of accusation. "None of us can. But we can learn from it, use it to shape who we become. The fact that you're here now, that you turned back to make things right, that says a lot about who you are, who you're choosing to be." His words resonated deeply with Rachel. She had spent so long defining herself by her achievements, by the external markers of success. But sitting here, in this quiet moment of connection, she realized that true growth came from these moments of vulnerability, of facing one's mistakes head on. "I want to be better," she said, surprising herself with the intensity of her words. Not just successful or accomplished, but better. As a person, I've lost sight of that somewhere along the way. John's smile widened, a warmth in his eyes that made Rachel feel truly seen for the first time in years. "That's the most important step," he said. "Recognizing the need for change, everything else follows from that." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. Rachel found herself marveling at the strange turns life could take. Here she was, sitting at a rest stop as the sun rose, having one of the most profound conversations of her life with a man she had once dismissed without a second thought. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a moment, waiting for John's nod before continuing. "When you stopped to help me last night, did you recognize me? From the diner, I mean." John's expression turned thoughtful. "I had a feeling," he admitted. "Something about you seemed familiar, but honestly, it didn't matter. I saw someone who needed help, and I was in a position to offer it. That's all there was to it." Rachel shook her head in amazement. "I don't know if I could have done that," she said. "If our positions had been reversed, if I had recognized you, I'm not sure I would have stopped." "Maybe not," John agreed, his tone free of judgment. "But the woman sitting here now, I think she would." His words hit Rachel with unexpected force. She realized that he was right. The person she had been even a few hours ago might have driven past, too, caught up in her own world to stop for a stranger. But now, everything felt different. "I want to make this mean something," Rachel said, her voice filled with newfound determination. "This second chance, this moment of connection, I don't want it to just be a nice story I tell myself to feel better. I want it to be a turning point." John nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It can be," he said, "but remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's a series of choices, day after day. Some days will be easier than others." Rachel smiled, feeling a sense of hope and possibility that had been missing from her life for longer than she cared to admit. "I'm ready for that," she said. "I'm ready to make those choices." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the world in soft hues of gold and pink, Rachel realized that this unexpected encounter had given her more than just the chance to make amends. It had opened her eyes to a different way of moving through the world, a perspective that valued kindness and understanding over competition and judgment. She turned to John, gratitude welling up inside her. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of everything that had passed between them. "Not just for forgiving me, but for showing me a different way forward." John's response was a warm smile and a gentle nod. In that moment, Rachel understood that true forgiveness wasn't just about wiping the slate clean. It was about creating space for growth, for transformation. And as she sat there, watching the new day unfold, she felt ready to step into that space, to become the person she now realized she wanted to be. The road ahead would not be easy. Old habits and ingrained ways of thinking wouldn't disappear overnight. But with the memory of this encounter, of John's kindness and wisdom, Rachel felt equipped to face the challenges ahead. She had been given a gift, not just of forgiveness, but of perspective, and she was determined to honor that gift in the way she lived her life moving forward. As the morning sun climbed higher, bathing the rest area in warm golden light, Rachel found herself reluctant to leave. The conversation with John had opened up something within her, a wellspring of emotions and realizations that she was only beginning to process. But the world waited for no one, and she knew she had responsibilities to face. "I should probably get going," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "I have a meeting in..." She glanced at her watch and let out a small, surprised laugh. "Well, I'm definitely going to be late." John nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Life has a way of throwing us curveballs," he said. "Sometimes they're exactly what we need." Rachel smiled, struck once again by the quiet wisdom in his words. "Think you're right about that," she agreed. She hesitated for a moment, then asked, Is there any way I can repay you? For the help with the car? And for, well, everything else?" John shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "No need," he replied. "Just pay it forward when you can. That's enough." His words resonated deeply with Rachel. In her world of transactions and bottom lines, the idea of helping without expectation of return felt almost radical. And yet, isn't that exactly what John had done for her? As they both stood, preparing to go their separate ways, Rachel felt a sudden urge to prolong the moment. Will I see you again?" she asked, surprised by how much she hoped the answer would be yes. John's smile widened slightly. "The world has a funny way of bringing people together when they need it most," he said. "Who knows? Our paths might cross again someday." With a final nod of farewell, John turned and walked back to his truck. Rachel watched him go, feeling as though she was watching a chapter of her life close, but also sensing that a new one was just beginning. As she made her way back to her own car, Rachel's mind was a whirl with thoughts and emotions. The contrast between her sleek, expensive vehicle and John's weathered pickup struck her anew. How many times had she judged people based on such superficial things? How much had she missed by viewing the world through such a narrow lens? Starting the engine, Rachel began the drive back towards the city, towards her familiar life. But as the miles rolled by, she knew that something fundamental had shifted within her. The Rachel who drove into work today would not be the same Rachel who had left it yesterday. Her phone, forgotten in the chaos of the night, buzzed insistently on the passenger seat. Glancing at it, Rachel saw a flood of missed calls and messages. Her assistant, worried about her absence, colleagues, wondering where she was, clients, anxious about the meeting she was now very late for. In the past, such a situation would have sent her into a panic. Her reputation, her image of unwavering professionalism, was everything. But now, as she navigated the morning traffic, Rachel found herself viewing the situation through a new lens. Yes, being late was inconvenient. Yes, she would have to deal with the consequences. But in the grand scheme of things, was it really as catastrophic as she would have once believed? The world hadn't stopped turning because Rachel missed a meeting. Life went on. As she pulled into her office parking lot, Rachel took a moment to gather herself. The familiar skyscrapers loomed above her, symbols of the success she had worked so hard to achieve. But for the first time, she found herself questioning what that success really meant. Walking into the office, Rachel was immediately accosted by her frantic assistant, Thomas. "Rachel, where have you been? The clients are furious. The partners are asking questions. I've been trying to reach you all night." Rachel held up a hand, her voice calm as she addressed not just Thomas, but the small crowd of colleagues who had gathered. "I'm sorry for the worry I've caused," she said, surprising herself with her own sincerity. "I had car trouble last night and no cell service. It's a long story, but I'm here now. Let's see what we can do to make things right." The response to her words was immediate: surprise, relief, and a hint of confusion from those who were used to a much more high-strung Rachel. As she made her way to her office, she overheard snippets of conversation. "Is that really Rachel? I've never heard her apologize like that before. She seems different." Settling into her chair, Rachel took a deep breath. The day ahead would be challenging, rescheduling meetings, smoothing ruffled feathers, catching up on missed work. But as she reached for her phone to begin making calls, she paused. Instead of diving straight into damage control, Rachel found herself opening a new email. The recipient field remained blank for a moment as she considered her next move. Then, with a small smile, she began to type. To all staff subject, a moment of gratitude. Colleagues, I want to take a moment to express my gratitude for each and every one of you. Your hard work, dedication, and patience, especially in light of this morning's chaos, do not go unnoticed. In the rush of our daily work, it's easy to lose sight of the human element that makes our successes possible. Today, I'm making a commitment to change that. I invite you all to join me in taking a moment each day to appreciate those around us, to offer help where we can, and to remember that behind every email, every report, every meeting, there's a person with their own struggles and triumphs. Let's make our workplace not just productive, but kind. Let's challenge ourselves to see beyond titles and bottom lines to the humanity in each other. Thank you for your understanding and for being part of this team. Best regards, Rachel. As she hit send, Rachel felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It was a small step, perhaps even a naive one in the cutthroat world of corporate finance. But it was a start. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Changing ingrained habits, reshaping a worldview built over years. These were not overnight tasks. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, times when the old Rachel would threaten to resurface. But as she turned to face the challenges of the day, Rachel held on to the memory of her conversation with John. She remembered his words about forgiveness, about the power of small kindnesses, about the importance of seeing the humanity in others. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Rachel felt truly alive. Not because of a successful deal or a promotion, but because she was embarking on the most important journey of all, the journey to become a better person. As she picked up her phone to make the first of many apologetic calls, Rachel smiled to herself. The day ahead would be difficult, but she was ready for it. More than that, she was looking forward to it. Because today wasn't just another day at the office, it was the first day of a new chapter in her life. And somewhere out there, driving his old pickup truck down a quiet highway, John continued on his own journey, unaware of the profound impact he had made. Two lives, briefly intersected, both forever changed by a simple act of kindness on a dark and rainy night. 6 months had passed since that fateful night on the highway, and Rachel's life had undergone a transformation that still surprised her at times. As she stood at the podium, facing a room full of expectant faces, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice clear and confident. "Thank you all for coming out tonight to support the Veterans Reintegration Program." The banquet hall was filled with a diverse crowd, corporate executives in sharp suits, veterans in dress uniforms, social workers, and community leaders. It was a gathering that the old Rachel would have found bewildering, perhaps even uncomfortable. But now, looking out at the sea of faces, she felt a sense of connection and purpose that went beyond networking or business opportunities. 6 months ago, Rachel continued, I had an experience that changed my life. It made me realize that success isn't just about profit margins or climbing the corporate ladder. It's about the impact we have on the lives around us, the kindness we show to strangers, and the way we choose to see the world. As she spoke, Rachel's mind drifted back to the changes she had implemented in her life since that night. It hadn't been easy. Old habits died hard, and there had been moments of doubt and backsliding. But with each passing day, each conscious choice to approach the world with more empathy and understanding, she had felt herself growing into the person she wanted to be. At work, her new approach had initially been met with skepticism. Some saw her emphasis on kindness and work-life balance as a sign of weakness. But as the months went by, something remarkable began to happen. Employee satisfaction increased, creativity flourished, even productivity went up as people felt more valued and supported. I stand before you tonight, not as a CEO, not as a success story, but as someone who is still learning, still growing, Rachel said, her words resonating through the hall. And I'm here to ask for your help in supporting those who have given so much for our country. As she outlined the program, a comprehensive initiative to help veterans transition back to civilian life, offering job training, mental health support, and community integration, Rachel felt a surge of pride. This was more than just a charitable endeavor or a PR move. It was a chance to make a real difference, to pay forward the kindness and understanding that John had shown her. After the speech, as Rachel mingled with the attendees, she found herself drawn into conversation after conversation. Veterans shared their stories of struggle and resilience. Business leaders discussed ways to create more inclusive workplaces. Community organizers offered insights into the challenges faced by returning service members. In each interaction, Rachel found herself listening more deeply, asking questions, and seeking to understand rather than to be understood. It was a stark contrast to the networking events of her past, where every conversation had been a calculated move in the chess game of career advancement. As the evening wore on, Rachel found herself in a quiet corner of the hall, taking a moment to absorb the energy of the event. That's when she saw him, a familiar figure standing near the entrance. His posture as steady and unassuming as she remembered. John. Their eyes met across the room, and Rachel felt a rush of emotion, gratitude, excitement, and a touch of nervousness. She made her way through the crowd, her heart pounding with each step. "You came," she said as she reached him, unable to keep the smile from her face. John nodded, a warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Wouldn't have missed it," he replied. "You've done good work here, Rachel." They fell into easy conversation, catching up on the months that had passed. Rachel learned that John had been involved in veteran support programs for years, working quietly behind the scenes to help his fellow service members. His presence at the event wasn't just as a guest, but as a consultant, helping to shape the program with his years of experience. As they talked, Rachel couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought her to this point. "You know," she said, her voice soft with realization, "I don't think I ever properly thanked you. Not just for helping me that night, but for helping me see things differently." John shook his head, that same modest gesture she remembered from their first encounter. "You did the hard work," he said. "I just opened a door. You chose to walk through it." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas, Rachel's assistant. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his tone apologetic but urgent. "But there's a situation that needs your attention, Rachel." In the past, such an interruption would have sent Rachel into crisis mode, all other concerns forgotten in the face of a work emergency. But now, she found herself pausing, taking a breath before responding. "What's the situation, Thomas?" she asked calmly. Thomas explained quickly. A major client was threatening to pull out of a deal, citing concerns about the company's new direction. They were demanding an immediate conference call with Rachel. The old Rachel would have excused herself immediately, rushing to damage control without a second thought. But as she stood there, caught between her past and her present, Rachel made a choice. "Thomas," she said, her voice steady, "please let them know that I'm currently at an important charity event. I'd be happy to schedule a call first thing in the morning to address their concerns. In the meantime, assure them that their business is valuable to us, and we're committed to finding a solution that works for everyone." Thomas blinked, surprised by her response, but nodded and hurried off to make the arrangements. John, who had overheard the exchange, raised an eyebrow. "Tough call," he said. "You sure about that?" Rachel nodded, feeling a sense of peace with her decision. "A few months ago, I would have dropped everything for that call," she admitted. "But I'm learning that there's more to life than being constantly available. This event, these people, they're important too." "The work will be there in the morning." John's smile widened. "Looks like you really have changed," he said, a note of pride in his voice. As the evening drew to a close, Rachel found herself reflecting on the months that had passed. The changes in her life hadn't always been easy. There had been resistance, from colleagues who didn't understand her new approach, from old habits that died hard, from a business world that often prioritized profit over people. But there had been triumphs too. The mentoring program she'd started at work, pairing seasoned executives with promising employees from diverse backgrounds. The volunteer days she'd instituted, encouraging her team to give back to the community. The shifts in company policy that prioritized work-life balance and mental health. More than that, there were the small, daily victories. The moments when she chose patience over frustration, understanding over judgment, kindness over expediency. They weren't always easy choices, but with each one, Rachel felt herself growing into the person she wanted to be. As the last of the guests filtered out, Rachel found herself standing with John near the exit. "So, what's next?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Rachel thought for a moment, her gaze drifting over the now empty banquet hall. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure," she admitted, "but I know it involves continuing to learn, to grow, to find ways to make a difference. This program is just the beginning." John nodded approvingly. "That's a good answer," he said. "Life's not about reaching a destination. It's about the journey." As they said their goodbyes, Rachel felt a sense of coming full circle. From that dark night on the highway to this moment, she had traveled a greater distance internally than she ever had externally. Walking to her car, the same one that had broken down that fateful night, Rachel paused, looking up at the star-filled sky. The future stretched out before her, full of possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt. But there would also be joy, growth, and the deep satisfaction of living a life aligned with her values. As she drove home, Rachel's mind was already buzzing with ideas for the future. Expanding the veteran program, finding ways to encourage other companies to prioritize social responsibility, maybe even writing a book about her experiences. But more than any specific plan, Rachel felt a sense of openness to what life might bring. She had learned that sometimes the most profound changes come from unexpected places, like a breakdown on a dark highway and the kindness of a stranger. The woman who pulled into her driveway that night was not the same one who had left it 6 months ago. She was softer in some ways, stronger in others, more compassionate, more patient, more alive to the world around her. And as Rachel stepped out of her car, looking up once more at the vast night sky, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for second chances, for unexpected teachers, for the ongoing journey of becoming the best version of herself. And somewhere out there, she knew, John was continuing his own journey. 2 lives, forever changed by a simple act of kindness, rippling outward to touch countless others. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Life rarely provides those. But it was something better, a new beginning, full of hope and possibility. Rachel smiled to herself as she walked to her front door. Tomorrow was a new day, another chance to make a difference, to be kind, to see the world through new eyes, and she was ready for it, grateful for every step of the journey that had brought her here, and excited for where it might lead next.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.